Keanu Reeves walked into the old auditorium quietly, the kind of place where the ceilings were tall, the walls echoed, and the air smelled faintly of chalk dust mixed with coffee. Students were already sitting in rows, flipping through their heavy textbooks and scribbling quick notes before the professor arrived. The university was known as one of the most prestigious in the world, a place where only the brightest minds came to study physics, mathematics, and theories that most people found impossible to understand. And in that world of scholars, Keanu was a visitor who didn't quite fit the usual picture. He wore a simple black jacket, jeans, and carried himself with his usual calm, almost invisible presence. No one expected him to know anything about the complex formulas that decorated the blackboard at the front. The professor entered with the kind of authority that made the students sit up straight without even being told. He was a man who had taught for decades, published papers, and carried the reputation of being sharp, brilliant, but also proud. He didn't like distractions, and he didn't like people who he thought wasted his time. When his eyes landed on Keanu sitting near the back, he raised his brows ever so slightly. Most of the students didn't notice, but those who did whispered softly, surprised that a famous Hollywood actor was sitting in their lecture hall. To them, it felt strange, almost out of place, like a movie star wandering into a research lab. "Ah," the professor said, his tone dripping with sarcasm, "we seem to have a guest today. I suppose physics is now entertaining enough for the movie industry." His words made some of the students chuckle nervously. No one dared to laugh loudly, but a few looked at Keanu with curious smiles, waiting to see how he would react. Keanu, however, didn't show any sign of irritation. He simply nodded politely, acknowledging the professor, and then returned his gaze to the notebook he had placed in front of him. His pen rested calmly between his fingers, as if he had come not to be noticed but to learn quietly, the way he always approached life. The professor continued the lecture, speaking rapidly about quantum mechanics, wave functions, and particles that behaved in ways no one could easily imagine. He filled the blackboard with lines of symbols, equations so long and complicated that an average person would feel dizzy just trying to follow them. The students nodded, some following eagerly, others pretending to understand, and a few furiously writing down notes hoping to make sense of them later. Every now and then, the professor glanced back at Keanu, his expression holding a kind of mocking curiosity, as if daring him to keep up with the pace. Keanu sat still, his eyes scanning the board with quiet focus. He wasn't trying to impress anyone, nor was he trying to prove anything. He loved learning, and though the world only knew him as an actor, very few understood that he had a deep curiosity about science, philosophy, and the way the universe worked. To him, physics wasn't just numbers, it was like reading poetry written by the universe itself. Each symbol had meaning, each equation a rhythm, and he respected it deeply. The professor, however, was not so patient. Halfway through the lecture, he turned suddenly toward Keanu, chalk still in his hand. "Mr. Reeves," he said in a sharp voice, drawing the attention of the entire room, "perhaps you can explain to us what I've just written on the board. Or is that too much outside your usual script?" His words made the room shift with tension. The students glanced at each other, unsure if they should laugh or stay silent. A few smirked, not out of cruelty but because they had grown used to their professor's biting humor. Still, everyone turned to see Keanu's reaction. Keanu looked up slowly, his calm eyes meeting the professor's. For a second, it seemed like he might refuse, might simply say he was only there to listen. Instead, he gave a gentle smile, one that didn't carry pride or irritation. "I came here to learn," he said softly, his voice steady, "but I'll do my best." He didn't rise to defend himself. He didn't show anger. He only showed quiet respect. The professor, however, dismissed his words with a wave of his hand, turning back to continue the lecture. But the challenge had already been set, and the students were waiting to see if this unusual guest could follow along. As the lecture continued, the professor brought up a problem, one that was infamous in the department. It was a puzzle of quantum mechanics, something so advanced that even graduate students struggled with it for weeks. He wrote the problem on the board, the chalk screeching slightly as he underlined it. "This," he announced, "is the kind of question that separates true physicists from pretenders. Perhaps our guest would like to attempt it?" His voice carried the weight of mockery, but also curiosity, because deep down he wanted to prove his point. All eyes turned again to Keanu. The room grew silent, the kind of silence that seemed to thicken the air. Keanu closed his notebook slowly, stood from his chair, and walked toward the front of the room. His steps were unhurried, almost humble, as though he wasn't walking to face a challenge but simply to share in the moment. He picked up the chalk gently, his hand steady, and looked at the equation on the board. The professor folded his arms, ready to enjoy what he thought would be an embarrassing failure. The students leaned forward, curious and unsure what to expect. Keanu studied the problem for a moment, his eyes scanning every symbol, every line, as if he were reading words on a page. Then, with calm precision, he began to write. His handwriting was neat, clear, and confident. Step by step, he broke down the problem, not rushing, not skipping, but carefully guiding the logic through each stage. The sound of chalk filled the air as he worked, and slowly the board transformed from a tangled mess of numbers into a clear, elegant solution. The students exchanged glances, their eyes widening in disbelief. This wasn't luck. This wasn't guessing. He was solving it with mastery. By the time Keanu finished, the blackboard was filled with a flawless solution. He placed the chalk down gently, turned back to the class, and gave a small, almost shy smile, as though he hadn't just chalked an entire room of scholars. Silence hung in the air, heavy and electric. The students couldn't believe what they had just seen. Even the professor, who had been so sure of Keanu's failure, stood frozen, his mouth slightly open. He quickly cleared his throat, trying to recover his composure. "Well," he said stiffly, "it appears you have some surprising knowledge." But his eyes betrayed his pride. What he had witnessed was undeniable. Keanu didn't bask in the moment, didn't boast or mock the professor back. Instead, he simply nodded politely, returned to his seat, and opened his notebook again. The students, however, couldn't take their eyes off him. Some whispered in awe, others smiled in admiration, and all of them felt the weight of something they would never forget. For the first time, they saw humility and genius standing quietly in the same person, and it left them both amazed and inspired. The classroom was still buzzing with quiet whispers long after Keanu returned to his seat. Some students glanced at him in awe, others in disbelief, but all of them knew they had witnessed something rare. Keanu, however, seemed completely untouched by the attention. He didn't look around to see who was impressed. He didn't lean back with pride. Instead, he calmly picked up his pen, returned to his notebook, and began jotting a few lines as though the equation he had just solved was nothing more than a simple warm-up exercise. His humility almost confused the students more than his brilliance. The professor, meanwhile, felt a sudden heaviness in his chest. For years, he had been the sharpest mind in the room, the one who held all the answers and tested others with difficult questions. His reputation was built on being unshakable, on proving time and again that he could outthink anyone. And now, in front of his brightest students, a guest he had mocked had calmly untangled one of his hardest problems without hesitation. He tried to dismiss it as coincidence, telling himself that perhaps Keanu had memorized the problem before or had stumbled across the solution somewhere. But deep down, he knew what he had just seen could not be explained away so easily. Still, the professor wasn't ready to surrender his pride. He cleared his throat and said, "Well, one solved problem doesn't make you a physicist. There are layers to understanding, deeper challenges that require years of discipline." His tone was sharp, but his eyes flickered with something else, an uneasy mix of respect and irritation. The students looked between the professor and Keanu, sensing a tension in the air. They could feel that this was no longer just a lecture, it was becoming something more, almost like a duel of intellects. The professor turned back to the board and began drawing another problem, this one even more complex than the first. It wasn't just difficult, it was the kind of question that made even advanced researchers pause. The students recognized it instantly. They had seen versions of it in journals and knew how famously tough it was. The professor explained the setup with confidence, his voice stronger now, as if reclaiming his control. This, he announced, is the kind of challenge that separates those who merely dabble from those who truly belong in this field. His eyes darted toward Keanu again, a silent invitation and a subtle provocation. Keanu looked up, his face calm, almost serene. He didn't rush to the board this time. Instead, he asked softly, "May I?" The professor gave a stiff nod, as though daring him to fail. Slowly, Keanu rose from his seat, his movements unhurried, his presence quiet but commanding in its own way. He walked to the board once more, picked up the chalk, and stared at the problem. For a brief moment, the room was so silent that the students could hear the faint scratching of pens from those still trying to copy the question. Then Keanu began. His approach was different from the professor's usual method. Where the professor was known for dense calculations and sharp logic, Keanu's style was almost like storytelling. He didn't just throw numbers onto the board. He explained as he worked, his voice steady and patient. "If we look at it this way," he said, writing slowly, "we can simplify the equation by imagining the system as two mirrors facing each other." He used metaphors that made the abstract concepts feel real, almost tangible. The students leaned forward, hanging on every word. For the first time, some of them felt they actually understood the problem instead of just memorizing steps. Minutes passed, and the board filled once again with lines of chalk, elegant and neat. The professor stood with his arms crossed, but his face betrayed flickers of unease. Each step Keanu wrote was correct. Each explanation was sound. By the time he reached the final line, there was no doubt he had solved it again, and not just solved it but made it seem almost simple. The students broke into quiet applause, hesitant at first, then growing louder. A few even whispered, "Incredible," unable to hold back their amazement. Keanu, however, didn't react to the applause. He simply set the chalk down, turned back to the class with a small, modest nod, and walked back to his seat as though nothing remarkable had happened. His calmness only deepened the respect he had earned. The professor tried to regain control of the moment. "Yes, well," he said briskly, "different approaches can sometimes work. It's interesting to see another perspective." But his voice lacked the usual confidence. The students noticed it. They had never seen their professor stumble for words. After the lecture ended, the students crowded around Keanu. Some asked how he had learned so much. Others wanted to know if he had studied physics formally. Keanu answered kindly but briefly. "I read a lot," he said simply. "I like to learn." His words carried no arrogance, no desire to impress. They were the words of someone who valued knowledge for its own sake. The professor, however, wasn't finished. Later that evening, he sent a message to Keanu, inviting him to his office for a private discussion. The words were polite, but the intent was clear. He wanted to test him further, away from the eyes of students. He wanted to understand if this was real brilliance or just coincidence. Keanu agreed without hesitation, his calm nature unchanged. The next day, in the quiet of the professor's office, the atmosphere was different. There were no whispers, no curious students watching. Just two men, a blackboard, and an unspoken challenge hanging in the air. The professor began with questions deep, complex, the kind that stretched into philosophy as much as science. To his surprise, Keanu didn't just answer them, he expanded them. He spoke of theories, experiments, and papers that even the professor had not expected him to know. He connected physics with philosophy, mathematics with art, and explained how science was not just about equations but about understanding the universe in a fuller way. The professor leaned back, silent for the first time. He realized that Keanu's knowledge was not shallow. It wasn't memorized. It was lived, absorbed through years of curiosity and reflection. The man who had seemed out of place in his lecture hall was, in fact, someone who belonged deeply to the world of ideas. That night, the professor couldn't sleep. His pride was wounded, yes, but more than that, he felt something else: respect. He knew he had underestimated someone based on appearances. And now, he understood the depth of the mistake. The students, meanwhile, continued to talk. They shared what they had seen, their voices carrying the story across campus. Some even joked that Keanu Reeves had given them their first real lesson in physics that they could truly understand. The story spread quickly, and soon, the entire university was buzzing about the mysterious guest who had humbled the most feared professor on campus. And while everyone else was busy talking, Keanu remained the same: quiet, respectful, and humble. He hadn't come to show off. He hadn't come to humiliate anyone. He had come simply to learn. Yet in doing so, he had given the students, and perhaps even the professor himself, a lesson they would never forget. The story of what happened in that lecture hall spread across the campus like wildfire. By the next morning, almost every student had heard about it. The whispers carried through cafeterias, libraries, and study rooms. Did you hear? Keanu Reeves solved the professor's hardest problems. Some added details, some exaggerated, but all agreed on one thing: something extraordinary had taken place. Students who had struggled for weeks to grasp even parts of those equations were now saying that Keanu had explained them with ease and clarity. For many of the students, it was more than just impressive. It was inspiring. They had always seen brilliance as something unreachable, locked behind complicated words and sharp attitudes. But Keanu had shown them another way. He had approached the board not with arrogance but with calm humility. He had spoken in a way that made sense, that made even the most abstract concepts feel alive. To them, it was a revelation. Suddenly, the idea of learning didn't feel like a burden, it felt like a door opening. The professor, however, wasn't ready to let the matter rest. His pride had been bruised. For decades, his lectures were the final word in the classroom. No one dared to challenge him, and certainly no one had outshined him in front of his students. He could feel the shift in the room from the previous day, the way the students' eyes had lit up not at his words but at Keanu's. He knew he needed to regain control, to remind them who the real authority was. So he devised a plan. That afternoon, he approached Keanu and said in a firm but polite tone, "Since you seem interested in these topics, perhaps you would join me for a private discussion. I'd like to see the depth of your knowledge without the distraction of an audience." His voice was calm, but underneath, it carried a challenge. He wanted to test Keanu in a place where no one else could interfere. Keanu agreed without hesitation. He didn't see it as a battle. To him, it was simply another chance to learn, to exchange ideas. When he arrived at the professor's office, he noticed the walls lined with books, volumes of physics, mathematics, and research journals stacked neatly on shelves. On the desk lay papers filled with equations. It was the room of a man who had dedicated his life to knowledge. Keanu respected that. He greeted the professor warmly, then sat down quietly, ready to listen. The professor began with simple questions, testing basic principles. Keanu answered easily, his explanations clear and thoughtful. Then the professor pushed deeper, asking about obscure theories, rare experiments, and advanced problems that even seasoned physicists debated over. To his surprise, Keanu not only knew about them but also offered perspectives that were unusual, almost poetic in their clarity. He spoke of particles as if they were characters in a story, of equations as if they were lines of music, each note playing its part in the grand symphony of the universe. The professor found himself listening, not just questioning. He realized that Keanu's way of thinking was different. It wasn't trapped in academic pride. It was free, creative, and deeply curious. While most physicists narrowed their focus to specific problems, Keanu connected ideas across fields, drawing lines between science, philosophy, and even art. He explained how concepts from ancient philosophy reflected in modern theories, how the mysteries of the universe weren't just about numbers but about meaning. Hours passed, and what was meant to be a test became a conversation. The professor found himself both challenged and fascinated. Keanu never claimed to be a master. He admitted when he didn't know something, but even then, he asked the kind of questions that revealed a deep understanding of how knowledge itself worked. He didn't approach physics as a list of answers but as a journey of endless discovery. Meanwhile, outside the office, the students continued to talk. They had started gathering in groups, replaying the scene in the lecture hall. Some said they had secretly recorded parts of it on their phones, and though the video was shaky, it was enough to spark curiosity. The clips began to circulate among students, and soon, small corners of the internet were buzzing with the story of Keanu Reeves stepping into a physics lecture and leaving everyone speechless. When Keanu finally left the professor's office that evening, he walked through campus quietly. A few students spotted him and waved shyly, almost as if they were greeting a mentor rather than a celebrity. Keanu waved back politely, then continued on his way, never lingering, never drawing attention to himself. To him, the day had been about learning, nothing more. The professor, however, sat in his office long after Keanu left, staring at the notes they had scribbled together on the board. His pride still stung, but another feeling had begun to take its place: admiration. He had underestimated this man. He had mocked him without reason. And now he saw that behind the quiet demeanor was not only intelligence but wisdom, the kind that couldn't be measured by degrees or titles. In the days that followed, the students noticed changes. The professor's lectures became sharper, yes, but also more thoughtful. It was as though he, too, had been challenged to think differently. He started allowing more questions in class, encouraging discussions rather than shutting them down. The students, emboldened by what they had seen, asked more, dared more, and the entire atmosphere began to shift. Keanu's presence on campus became almost legendary. Some students whispered that he had embarrassed the professor on purpose, but those who had spoken with him knew the truth: Keanu wasn't trying to humiliate anyone. He was simply being himself, a man who loved knowledge and shared it with humility. That was what made the impact so powerful. The story didn't stay on campus for long. Within weeks, news outlets caught wind of it. Headlines began to appear online: Keanu Reeves shocks elite university with physics knowledge, and Hollywood star humiliates professor with brilliant solution. While the headlines were flashy, the reality was more nuanced. Keanu himself never spoke publicly about it. When asked, he simply said, "I enjoy learning. It's good to share ideas." But his silence only made people more curious, and the story grew. Back in the lecture halls, the students carried a new energy. They weren't just inspired by Keanu's brilliance but by his humility. They realized that genius didn't have to come with arrogance, that true knowledge could be shared with kindness. For many of them, that was the greatest lesson they had ever received. And while the professor still struggled with his pride, he couldn't ignore the effect it had on his students. He had always wanted to inspire them, to push them toward greatness. And now, through an unexpected visitor, they had found that spark. It humbled him, yes, but it also reminded him why he had become a teacher in the first place. The memory of those days would stay with the students forever. For them, it wasn't just about equations or problems. It was about seeing a man the world knew as an actor reveal himself as something more: a seeker of truth, A hidden genius who showed that learning was not about status or recognition but about curiosity and respect for the mysteries of life. The tension between the professor and Keanu did not end in the office. The university had scheduled a major seminar that week, one attended not just by students but also by visiting scholars from other institutions, researchers, and a few influential figures from the academic world. It was the kind of event where reputations were built, where papers were presented, and where young students often got their first chance to see some of the greatest minds debate ideas. For the professor, this seminar was his stage, a chance to shine before peers and prove once again that he was the authority in his field. But this time, he had something else on his mind. Keanu's unexpected brilliance had unsettled him. He had watched his students lean toward this quiet guest as though he were their true teacher, and the professor wasn't ready to let that impression last. So, he crafted a plan. In the middle of the seminar, in front of everyone, he would challenge Keanu openly. He would push him into a situation so complex, so demanding, that even if Keanu had a natural gift, he would surely falter. It wasn't cruelty, not exactly. It was the professor's way of proving that mastery belonged to the trained, to those who had earned their place through years of academic struggle. The day of the seminar arrived. The large hall filled with people, their voices blending into a low hum of anticipation. Some were there to present, others to observe, and many simply wanted to learn from the discussions that would unfold. Keanu sat quietly among the audience, dressed simply as always, unnoticed by most until whispers began to spread that he was present. A few students who had seen him in the lecture nudged their friends and whispered excitedly, "That's him. That's the one who solved the problems." The rumor traveled quickly, and soon, many eyes turned toward him with curiosity. The professor began the seminar with his usual confidence, presenting ideas, outlining recent studies, and discussing new possibilities in quantum research. His voice filled the room with authority, and the scholars nodded, impressed as always. But beneath the surface, he was waiting for his moment. Finally, when the discussion turned toward the future of quantum computing, he paused dramatically. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, his eyes sweeping across the hall, "we have with us today an unexpected guest. Mr. Keanu Reeves? Many of you may know him as an actor, but he has shown surprising interest in our field. Perhaps he would like to share his thoughts on the role of quantum mechanics in shaping future technologies." The room shifted instantly. A murmur rippled through the audience. All eyes turned toward Keanu. Some looked amused, others skeptical, and a few leaned forward eagerly, remembering what they had already witnessed in class. Keanu, as always, did not flinch. He stood slowly, his face calm, and gave a small nod. He hadn't come to speak, but if invited, he would not refuse. With quiet steps, he walked to the front of the hall, and the room grew silent, the air heavy with expectation. He stood there for a moment, letting the silence settle. Then, in his steady voice, he began to speak. "Quantum mechanics," he said softly, "is not just about numbers or machines. It's about how we understand the very fabric of reality. And when we talk about quantum computing, we are not simply talking about faster devices, we are talking about changing the way humans think and solve problems." The audience leaned in. Keanu spoke without notes, without slides, but with clarity that captured everyone's attention. He explained how quantum computers, unlike classical ones, could think in many directions at once, opening doors to discoveries that seemed impossible before. But more than the technical details, he spoke of meaning. Every discovery, he said, isn't just about power or control. It's about connection. How we connect ideas, how we connect with each other, and how we connect with the mysteries of existence. Technology is only as powerful as the humanity that guides it. The students scribbled notes furiously. The scholars exchanged glances, surprised by the depth of his perspective. It wasn't just accurate, it was inspiring. He blended science with philosophy, showing them that knowledge was not meant to be locked in ivory towers but shared with everyone. He spoke of how creativity and science were not enemies but allies, how imagination fueled innovation, and how humility was as important as brilliance in pursuing truth. By the time he finished, the hall erupted into applause. It wasn't the polite kind of applause given at academic talks. It was loud, genuine, and filled with admiration. Some of the students even stood, clapping with excitement. For them, it wasn't just a lecture, it was a moment they would remember for the rest of their lives. The professor sat stiffly, his hands clasped together. He wanted to dismiss Keanu's words, to downplay them, but the response of the audience made it impossible. Even visiting scholars were nodding with approval, whispering to each other about the unexpected brilliance of this quiet man. He realized, with a sharp pang, that his plan had backfired. Instead of exposing Keanu, he had given him the biggest stage of all, and Keanu had not only held his own but had shined brighter than anyone else. When the applause finally settled, Keanu gave a modest bow, thanked the audience softly, and returned to his seat. He didn't look triumphant. He didn't act as though he had won anything. To him, it had been a conversation, a chance to share ideas. But for those who witnessed it, it was something more, a reminder that true genius doesn't need to prove itself. It simply reveals itself, quietly and naturally. After the seminar ended, groups of students surrounded Keanu again, asking questions, eager to hear more. He answered with patience, taking time to explain even the smallest details, never making anyone feel foolish for not understanding. His kindness made him even more admirable. Meanwhile, the professor lingered at the front of the hall, speaking briefly with colleagues but distracted. His pride was wounded deeper now, yet he couldn't deny the truth. Keanu had something rare, something that went beyond the boundaries of academic training. That evening, the story spread beyond the campus walls. Some students had recorded Keanu's talk on their phones, and clips quickly appeared online. Within hours, social media platforms were buzzing with headlines: Keanu Reeves stuns scholars with quantum talk and actor leaves physics professor speechless. People around the world watched the videos, amazed not only at Keanu's unexpected knowledge but also at his humility. He didn't posture or pretend to be more than he was. He simply shared what he loved. For the students who had been there, the experience was transformative. Many of them said it was the first time they felt genuinely inspired to study science, not for grades or recognition but for the joy of discovery. A few even wrote in their journals that it was the day they realized genius wasn't about titles but about passion and humility. The professor, though still struggling with his pride, began to see something he hadn't seen in years. His students were more alive, more curious, more engaged than ever before. They were asking better questions, thinking more freely, and daring to connect ideas beyond the textbook. As much as it pained him, he knew Keanu had sparked that change. And for the first time, he wondered if perhaps he had been teaching the wrong way, through fear and authority instead of inspiration and curiosity. The day ended with the campus alive in conversation. Everyone seemed to carry the energy of what they had witnessed. And through it all, Keanu remained the same, quiet, humble, and ready to step away without fanfare. To him, it wasn't about being right, or being admired. It was about sharing a love for knowledge and leaving behind a spark in others. The days that followed the seminar felt different across the entire campus. Students walked with more energy, conversations carried more excitement, and everywhere you went, people seemed to be talking about the same story: the day Keanu Reeves stunned the academic world. What had begun as whispers in lecture halls had now become a wave that reached far beyond the university. News outlets picked it up, social media spread it like wildfire, and before long, clips of Keanu calmly solving equations and giving his talk on quantum computing were trending across the internet. People from all corners of the world were watching the videos, their reactions filled with surprise and admiration. For the students who had been there in person, it felt almost surreal. They would tell the story to their friends, their families, even strangers online. He didn't brag, he didn't show off, one student wrote in a blog post that quickly went viral. He just stood there, explained everything in such a simple way, and left us speechless. It was the first time I felt like physics wasn't a mountain I could never climb, it felt like something I could actually touch. Comments like these filled forums and online spaces, showing how deeply Keanu's words had reached people who weren't even in the room. Meanwhile, the professor found himself in a position he had never experienced before. For years, he had been untouchable, the authority whose word was final. But now, he was the one being questioned. His students still respected him, but their eyes had changed. When he lectured, they compared his explanations with Keanu's clarity. When he spoke sharply, they remembered Keanu's kindness. The professor knew he could not erase what had happened, and though it hurt his pride, he also knew it had taught him something valuable. He had built his authority on fear and control, but Keanu had shown that true influence came from humility and respect. One afternoon, unable to carry the weight of his thoughts any longer, the professor invited Keanu to meet him privately again. This time, his tone was different. He wasn't preparing to challenge him or expose him. He wanted to talk, honestly, without the mask of authority. When Keanu arrived, the professor sighed and said quietly, "I owe you an apology. I underestimated you. I judged you unfairly. I thought you were here to waste time, and I let my pride blind me to the truth." His words were heavy, but sincere. Keanu listened calmly, his expression soft. Then he said, "You don't need to apologize to me. Everyone underestimates someone at some point. What matters is what we learn from it." The professor looked at him in silence, realizing that Keanu wasn't just intelligent, he was wise. And for the first time in many years, the professor felt humbled not by humiliation but by respect. The two of them spoke for hours. They discussed not only physics but also teaching, learning, and life itself. Keanu shared how his love for knowledge had always been a private journey, something he pursued quietly in his own time. He never sought recognition, because to him, the joy was in the discovery itself. The professor shared his fears, how he had felt the need to always appear flawless in front of his students, to never let anyone see weakness. Keanu smiled gently and said, "Sometimes, letting them see your humanity is the greatest lesson you can give." Those words stayed with the professor long after their meeting ended. Outside their private conversations, the legend of what had happened continued to grow. Students began writing articles in the university newsletter, sharing how Keanu's presence had changed the atmosphere of the campus. Professors from other departments even mentioned it in their classes, pointing out how inspiration could come from the most unexpected places. A philosophy professor remarked, "Knowledge is not owned by degrees or titles, it belongs to anyone who seeks it sincerely." The students nodded, thinking of Keanu as the perfect example. Online, debates raged about how someone from outside the academic world could speak with such depth. Some skeptics claimed it must have been staged, but those who had been in the room defended him passionately. "You can't fake that kind of understanding," one student wrote in response to a doubtful comment. "And you definitely can't fake the humility he showed. That's what made it real." Keanu, however, remained silent through it all. He didn't give interviews, didn't try to take credit, and didn't respond to the endless questions from journalists. He simply went back to his quiet life, just as he always did. To him, it was never about the attention. He didn't see himself as a hero or a genius. He was just someone who loved learning and happened to share it when asked. That was enough. The university itself eventually acknowledged the moment. Though they didn't issue an official statement, some of the staff began quietly using it as an example in their discussions with students. "Never judge a book by its cover," one senior lecturer reminded a group of undergraduates. "You never know who might be carrying wisdom in silence." The lesson had gone beyond physics, it had become a life lesson for everyone who had heard the story. For the students who had witnessed it firsthand, it became one of the most important memories of their university years. Years later, when they graduated and looked back, they didn't only remember the exams or the textbooks. They remembered the day a Hollywood actor walked into their lecture hall, was mocked, and then revealed himself as a hidden genius who inspired them in ways no one else ever had. As for the professor, the experience transformed him deeply. Slowly, his teaching style began to change. He still demanded excellence, but he stopped using fear as his tool. Instead, he began to encourage curiosity, to invite questions, and to show patience when students struggled. Some noticed that he even smiled more often, something they had rarely seen before. Though he never admitted it openly to the whole class, those who had spoken with him privately knew the truth. Keanu had left his mark on him as much as on the students. In the end, the story of Keanu Reeves at the university became more than just a viral headline. It became a reminder to everyone who heard it that genius can hide in plain sight, that humility can be more powerful than pride, and that learning is not about status but about passion. People carried that story with them, retelling it to friends, passing it along as a source of inspiration, and reminding each other that you should never underestimate someone simply because of who you think they are. And Keanu? He disappeared back into the quiet rhythm of his life, as though nothing extraordinary had happened at all. That was his way. He didn't crave the spotlight. He didn't chase recognition. He simply continued being himself, humble, curious, and quietly brilliant. The students and even the professor might never see him again, but they would always remember the day he walked into their world, shattered their assumptions, and left them with a gift greater than any equation, the belief that learning belongs to everyone, and that true greatness is carried in silence.